Everybody, welcome back. I'm Uncle Nate, and I'm here to read The Great Brain at the Academy, and we've already done chapter 1. This is chapter 2. I'm back in Meredith's room. I've got a little stuffed animal bear over here with me, and let's go ahead and get at it. Chapter 2 is called Tom at the Throttle. All week, I wondered what could possibly have happened to Tom on his first train ride that made it the most exciting experience of his life. When I finally received his second letter, I understood why he had said that all the kids in town would turn green with envy. When I showed the kids the letter, they didn't actually turn green any more than a yellow-bellied coward has a yellow belly. But you never saw such a bunch of envious kids in all your life. Now, when Tom came home for the Christmas vacation with Swain, he told Papa, Mama, Aunt Bertha, our 4-year-old foster brother Frankie, and me all about riding in the locomotive from Provo to Salt Lake City. Hearing him tell it was 10 times more exciting than reading about it. Tom's great brain had already figured this out. He charged the kids 2 cents apiece to enter our barn and listen to him personally tell about his exciting experience. And every kid in town from 4 years old to 16 was there. I, of course, had to get Swain's side of the story, which was a little different from Tom's story. But by putting both together, I can tell just about exactly what did happen. After collecting his $3 from the grateful poker players, Tom went to the other end of the smoking car and sat down beside the candy butcher. He collected the 75 cents worth of candy that the man owed him. "Why do they call you a butcher?" he asked. It's a show business slang word," the candy butcher said. "In vaudeville and burlesque theaters, men who sell candy during intermission are called candy butchers. When men began selling candy and things on trains, the name just stuck." "I don't see how you make any money," Tom said. "The train fare must eat up all the profits." "I ride the trains for free," the candy butcher said. "My run is from Cedar City to Ogden and back." Tom returned to his seat and dumped 15 5-cent bars of candy on it. "I made a deal with the candy butcher," he told Swain. "He let me sell the rest of our lunch if I'd buy candy with it. I got 75 cents. "Half of that lunch was mine," Swain said. "You got 20 cents from the salesman and 25 cents more, which makes 95 cents. You can have the odd nickel because you did all the work. Just give me my 45 cents in cash." Poor old Swain was a dreamer if he thought he was going to talk the great brain out of 45 cents. "If I remember correctly," Tom said, "you told me I was a conniver for selling part of the lunch, and Mama would have a fit if she knew about it. I sure as heck don't want it on my conscience that I made a conniver out of my own brother and made him partly responsible for our mother having a fit. So I will just keep all the profits and my conscience will be clear. But dividing the profits and giving my brother some candy are 2 different things. Help yourself to as many bars as you can eat." Swain knew he was beat. He helped himself to a chocolate bar and a peanut butter bar. Tom put 1 bar of candy in his pocket. Then he got down his suitcase and put the remaining 12 bars of candy between his clothing. Swain stared at him bug-eyed. "Just what do you think you're doing?" he asked. "If the fellows at the academy are only allowed 10 cents worth of candy every 4 weeks," Tom said, "I shouldn't have any trouble selling these 5-cent bars of candy for a dime each. And once I get my candy store going, I'll make a fortune." "Have you gone plumb loco?" Swain asked. "What candy store?" Tom closed his suitcase and put it back on the rack. "The candy store I'm going to open at the academy," he said, rubbing his hands together. "I'll double my money on every bar of candy I sell." "No, you won't," Swain said. "There is no possible way for you to smuggle enough candy into the academy to start a candy store. And I'm not going to let you smuggle in even those 12 bars. I'll tell Father Rodriguez they're in your suitcase." Now, Tom was as flabbergasted as a duck who discovers it can't swim. "Do you mean to tell me you would inform on your own brother?" he asked. "I can't help it," Swain said. "I promised Mom and Dad that I would keep an eye on you. And if you get into any trouble, they're going to blame me." Tom munched on his bar of candy while he put his great brain to work. "I sure feel sorry for you if you do tell," he finally said. "That would force me to tell all the kids at the academy that my big brother's a tattletale. And that, SD, will make you about as popular as a skunk in a parlor." Swain was beat, and he knew it. "That's blackmail," he said, "but all right. I want a signed statement from you that any trouble you get into at the academy is your own fault. I'll need to show it to Mom and Dad when you get expelled." "That's fair enough," Tom said. He got down his suitcase and removed a notebook and pencil from it. Holding the suitcase on his knees, he wrote, "To whom it may concern. No matter what happens to me at the Catholic Academy for Boys, I take all the blame personally. T.D. Fitzgerald." He tore the page from the notebook and handed it to Swain. "Does that satisfy you?" he asked. Swain read the note. "I'm satisfied," he said. Tom was no dummy. He handed the pencil and notebook to Swain. "Now write what I tell you," he said. "To whom it may concern, I promise not to interfere with anything my brother does at the Catholic Academy for Boys. And sign it." Swain wrote the statement and handed it to Tom. "I'm not interfering," he said, "just giving you some brotherly advice. Every once in a while they have an inspection at the academy. The priests search your locker, desk, suitcase, and any other place you might hide candy. Or magazines we aren't supposed to read, or anything else that might be forbidden." "Well, that's my worry, not yours," Tom said. Then he took the $3 silver from his pocket and began jingling them in his hand. "Where'd you get all that money?" Swain asked, as astonished as he could be. Tom told him about the marked deck of cards and the poker players. Swain couldn't help feeling a little envious. Tom had made a neat profit of $4.20 on his first train ride, and 25 cents of that was formerly Swain's money. Papa had often said when a person starts to envy another person, the devil is right there to whisper in his ear. Right then, the devil was whispering to Swain how he could get even. "The money won't do you any good at the academy," he said. "There's no place to spend it." "What's the matter with spending it outside the academy?" Tom asked. "We only get outside the walls one day every 4 weeks, Swain said. "Father Rodriguez or one of the other priests is always with us even then. And all you can spend is 10 cents for candy." "If you can't spend any money, where do you go?" Tom asked. "Sometimes the priests take us on a nature study hike or a picnic," Swain said. "Sometimes we just go sightseeing or to the museum or art gallery. And once in a while, as a treat, we get to go to the Salt Lake Theater. Buying a ticket to get in is the only way you can spend any money." "What about sports?" Tom asked. Swain was really enjoying the look of dismay on Tom's face. "What sports?" he asked. "The only athletics at the academy is 1 hour of calisthenics in the gymnasium on school days. And the gym is nothing but an old barn with a hardwood floor." By this time, Tom was almost wishing he had been born a Mormon or a Protestant. "You never told Papa and Mama it was like a prison," he said. "I'm no crybaby," Swain said. And then he really poured salt in Tom's wounds. "Thank the Lord, this is my last year at the academy, because they only have the 7th and 8th grades. Next year, I'll be going to high school in Pennsylvania and living with some of Papa's relatives. And while I'm enjoying myself there, I promise I'll think of you often, little brother, and how you are suffering at the academy." Tom felt so down in the dumps he didn't even get angry at the little brother bit. Swain made the academy sound as if all the students had to wear striped suits with numbers on them. He knew there was only one thing to do. No candy, no sports, no nothing, he said. I guess I'll have to put my great brain to work on it and get some changes made at the academy. The only thing you'll change will be yourself, Swain said, from an enrolled student to an expelled student. The Jesuit priests are plenty sharp because they have been dealing with boys for years. You won't be able to put anything over on them. Did that discourage Tom? Heck no! He was confident he could make life easier for himself and the other kids at the academy. A few minutes later, Mr. Walters came into the coach. "Provo's the next stop," he called out. "There will be a 20-minute stopover for passengers to get something to eat. The dining room is located right next to the depot." Swain stood up when the train stopped. "I'm going to get a glass of milk and piece of pie in the dining room," he said. "Go ahead," Tom said. "I'm not hungry." Tom wasn't just twisting a lamb's tail trying to make it bark like a dog when he said he had to learn all about trains by the time he arrived in Salt Lake City. But how could he if he didn't get to ride in the locomotive? He realized it was something every kid dreams about, but only 1 in a million ever gets to do. He got off the train with Swain and walked up to where the locomotive was preparing to take on water and coal. He had seen many locomotives in Aidenville, but this was the first time it had entered his mind that they were things of beauty. The locomotive had the shiny 205 on the round brass plate on its nose, a shiny brass bell, a whistle and headlight, a blue steel belly, and gigantic wheels. With smoke coming from the smokestack and steam escaping from the cylinders, it was almost as if the locomotive was a living thing. Tom walked back and waited for Mr. Walters to come out of the station master's office. "Think they'll ever have it so passengers can eat right on a train?" he asked. "Oh, it's coming, Tom," the conductor said. "We already have sleeping cars on the main line, invented by a man named Pullman, and a man named Fred Harvey is working on a dining car that will serve hot meals right on the train." "Well, you sure have taught me a lot about trains," Tom said, "but I'll never know all I should unless you fix it so I can ride in the locomotive from here to Salt Lake City." "Well, I can't do that, Tom," Mr. Walters said. "It's against regulations." The conductor didn't know it, but he had walked right into Tom's trap. "It's also against regulations to let card sharks operate on trains," Tom said. "This Harrison fellow could have gone on cheating passengers for years if it hadn't been for me. And you can report how these crooked decks of cards are marked at the factory so other conductors will know how to spot them. I figure the railroad owes me something for that." Mr. Walters nodded. "Well, when you put it that way," he said, "I agree. The railroad owes you a ride in the locomotive. But you'll get your clothes all dirty." Tom was so happy he wanted to do a little dance. "I've got a rain slicker and rain hat in my suitcase I can wear." "Oh, go get 'em," Walters said. "But come up to the locomotive on the other side of the train. I don't want the station master to see you. I haven't time to explain to him right now." Swain was back in his seat when Tom entered the coach. He stared bug-eyed as Tom opened the suitcase and put on his rain slicker and hat. "Have you gone plumb loco?" he asked. "It isn't raining, and even if it was, you can't get wet in here." "I'm going to ride in the locomotive and don't want to get my clothes dirty," Tom said. "In a pig's eye," Swain said. "Just make sure you take my suitcase off the train when we get to Salt Lake City," Tom said. Poor Swain just sat there with his mouth open as he watched Tom leave the coach. Tom ran around to the other side of the train and up to the locomotive. He could hear Mr. Walters talking to the engineer. "I got a passenger for you, Ed, from here to Salt Lake City," the conductor said. "He's a boy about 11 or 12 years old. He has a curious mind and will ask you a lot of questions." "I get it," Ed said. "Hey, he must be the son of some big shot on the railroad." "I haven't time to explain now," Mr. Walters said. "Just make sure He gets off on the opposite side from the depot so the station master doesn't see him. You'll find him waiting on the other side now." A moment later, the engineer put his head out of the cab window. "Well, come on up to the deck, boy," he said. Tom was so excited he almost slipped and fell as he climbed into the cab of the locomotive. The engineer was wearing blue overalls, a blue shirt, and a blue cap with a long visor. He had a red bandana handkerchief tied around his neck. The fireman was dressed the same, but his face, hands, and clothing were covered with coal dust. "My name's Ed," the engineer said, "and the fireman's name is Bill. What's your name, boy?" "Tom Fitzgerald," Tom answered. The engineer scratched his head. Funny," he said. "I've never heard of any big shot on this railroad by that name." Tom knew he'd better change the subject quickly. "Hey, why did you tell me to come up to the deck?" he asked. "I thought only boats have decks." "The platform of a locomotive's called the deck by railroad men," Ed answered. Now stand back from the gangway so Bill can slug the firebox." Tom stepped back. He watched the fireman use the end of a scoop shovel to open the door of the firebox. He was surprised as the intense heat coming from the burning coal. He watched Bill stoke the firebox with coal taken from the tinder. "Well, that ought to take care of it till we get to Salt Lake City," Bill said, shutting the door of the firebox. "We're going to have to pound her to make up for the few minutes we're late," Ed said. Tom was puzzled. "I understood gangway meant the rear part of the deck," he said, "and I knew when you told Bill to slug the firebox you wanted him to put more coal in it. But what do you mean by pounding her?" "Oh, it's railroad talk. I mean, we've got to get all the speed we can safely get out of this locomotive," Ed said. "You see that cord? The one on the left? It rings the bell to let passengers know we'll be leaving in a few minutes. Don't yank on it too hard or the bell will just spin around. You can tell by the feel of the cord and the sound of the bell when you're doing it just right." Boy, oh boy, was Tom in his glory. He never expected they'd let him ring the bell. He had heard locomotive bells many times in Aidenville, but the sound of the bell on engine number 205 as he rang it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "Oh, that's enough," Ed said. "Now I've got to look out the cab window now so I can see when the conductor gives us the highball." A highball is another railroad term, Tom. It means the arm signal to start. Now get your hand on that other cord that blows the whistle and give it 2 quick pulls when you hear the conductor call all aboard. By this time, Tom was more excited than a dog chasing a rabbit. In a couple of minutes, he heard Mr. Walters calling, "All aboard!" Tom jerked the cord twice and heard 2 short blasts from the steam whistle. "Do we start now?" he asked. "Not until the conductor gives me the arm signal," Ed said. "Oh, there it is. Now grab that hand railing so you don't fall." Tom took hold of the hand railing. He watched the engineer release the air brakes. Ed turned a valve, then put his left hand on a bar about 2 feet long with a round handle on one end. "Now, this used to be called a Johnson bar," Ed said, "but now we call it the throttle. The farther I push it forward, the more steam pressure it will release to the cylinders, and the faster we will go. I'll take it nice and easy, so we don't jerk the cars we're pulling up till we get underway. A steam locomotive is about the simplest machine ever invented, but each one is just a little bit different. You take this one. I have to sort of coax it and drive it by the feel of the throttle." The train began to move as Ed slowly pushed the throttle forward. "Why do you say it's a simple machine?" Tom asked. "It has a firebox into which we put coal to burn," Ed said as the train began to pick up speed. "Now this heats the water in the boiler, producing steam. The steam is released to each cylinder, and its pressure pushes the pistons. The pistons are attached to rods, which are connected with the drivers. The steam pressure in the cylinders moves the pistons back and forth, and this moves the rods that make the drivers go round." "Why do you call the wheels drivers?" Tom asked. "Because they are the wheels that actually drive the locomotive," Ed answered. "This is an American Type 440 locomotive, which means the drive wheels are 4.5 feet high. The drivers on locomotive built to pull a freight train are smaller, which gives the wheels more pulling power. And on fast passenger trains, they use locomotives with larger drivers because the bigger the drivers, the faster a locomotive can go. Tom was getting used to the rocking motion of the locomotive, and he let go of the handrail. "How fast will number 205 go?" he asked. "She'll do a mile a minute on the straightaway," Ed answered. And Walters was certainly right. "You do have a curious mind." Tom didn't want the engineer to get bored answering questions. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I must learn all about locomotives by the time we reach Salt Lake City. I won't ask any more questions if you don't want me to, though." "Go ahead. Ask all the questions you want," Ed said. "What's the fastest a train will go?" Tom asked, quickly taking advantage of the offer. "Engine number 999, pulling the Empire State Express between Syracuse and Buffalo, New York, ran a measured mile at 112.5 miles per hour back in 1893, Ed said. "Boy, oh boy," Tom exclaimed. "That's really traveling." "Hey, we're coming to a road crossing," Ed said. "Grab the whistle cord and give 3 long blasts." Tom pulled the cord. He discovered as long as he held it down, the whistle kept on blowing, and when he let it up, the whistle stopped. A few minutes later, Ed spoke to the fireman. "Hey, we're coming to that bad curve now, Bill," he said. "I'm going to take it 10 miles above our usual speed. You know what to do." Tom was astonished as he saw Bill go to the side of the cab, opposite the engineer, place his hands against it, and push. "As long as you're here, Tom," Bill said, "give me a hand so engine number 205 doesn't tip over." Tom stood beside Bill and began to push. He could hear Bill grunting as if using all his strength as they went around the curve. Tom pushed as hard as he could until he heard both Ed and Bill laughing. "Don't feel bad about it, Tom," Ed said. "I had a green fireman one time who fell for it too. And to make up for playing a little joke on you, I'm going to let you drive, engine 205. No sense in riding a locomotive if you can't tell your friends you drove one. Now get over here in front of me, put your left hand on the throttle, and your head out the cab window." Tom did as he was told. "We've got a straightaway coming up now for a few miles," Ed said. "I'm going to give it all old number 205's got." Tom felt Ed pushing the throttle forward. With his head out the cab window and the wind whistling in his ears, it seemed as if they were flying. "I'm going to take my hand off the throttle now," the engineer said. "Hold her steady. There you go, Tom. You are now driving number 205 at 60 miles an hour. Tom said later that was the happiest moment of his entire life. Many times in his life he had made his great brain work like 60, but this was the first time he'd ever actually traveled at 60 miles an hour. Ed only let him drive the locomotive for about a minute, but that was enough. It was with a feeling of regret that he said goodbye to Ed and Bill when the train arrived at the depot in Salt Lake City. "Goodbye, and thanks," he said. "I'll remember both of you and number 205 for the rest of my life." "Bill and I enjoyed having you with us," Ed said. "When we were boys your age, we both used to dream about riding in a locomotive. I guess that's why we became railroad men." Tom climbed down the iron rungs of the locomotive to the ground. Then he went around the train to meet Swain. Tom was just about the happiest kid in the world right then, but he sure as heck wasn't a happy kid for long. And if he'd known what lay ahead of him that day, he would probably have climbed back into the cab of the locomotive and just kept on going. And that's the end of Chapter 2.